Hello everyone, my name is Adam Flores, and in this presentation I will provide you with my research into the theory of invitational rhetoric. Throughout this presentation I will provide you with the origins of rhetoric, an overview of invitational rhetoric theory, some of the critiques of the theory, as well as some of the applications of the theory. The scholars suggest that rhetoric has been around and has been used since as early as the 5th century BC. Rhetoric is associated with the idea of persuasion and change, and many of the Greek philosophers and scholars of the time often engaged in debates and arguments about some of the theories and the ideologies that were arising during this time of knowledge, a quest for knowledge and understanding in the Western world. Now, one of the first individuals who's known to be associated with the idea of rhetoric would be an individual named Gorgias. Gorgias is credited with being the founder of sophistry, and a sophist would be considered an ancient Greek teacher who used philosophy and rhetoric to teach his students. And two other individuals who are probably a little more well known than Gorgias that also used rhetoric would be Plato and Aristotle. Plato being the founder of the Academy of Athens, which is considered to be the first institution of higher learning in the Western world, and Aristotle being arguably Plato's most well-known student. Now, invitational rhetoric was proposed by Sonja Foss and Cindy Griffin, both professors of communication at the University of Colorado and Colorado State respectively. And the reason that they decided to found this new theory was due to their research and understanding of traditional rhetoric. And they believed that traditional rhetoric maintained a very patriarchal bias, which led to persuasion, domination of the individuals being spoken to, and ultimately a rhetor's desire to change and influence an audience to see things their way, ultimately devalued the lives and perspectives of those individuals that were being forced to change their perspectives. And so in deciding to come up with a new theory, Foss and Griffin looked to feminism as the basis for their theory of invitational rhetoric. And this being due to the fact that feminism seeks social, political, and economic equality for all women within the existing power structures. Now, Foss and Griffin posit that their theory is applicable in a much broader sense to more than just women. They suggest that it can be used by anybody who's looking for equality in the conversation. Now, their definition of invitational rhetoric states that it is an invitation to understanding as a means to create a relationship rooted in equality, immanent value, and self-determination. Foss and Griffin suggest that to engage in the process of invitational rhetoric, there's two rhetorical forms that take place. The first being offering perspectives. Foss and Griffin state that this is an invitation into the rhetor's world. And what they mean by this is that I, as the rhetor, would offer my beliefs, my perspectives, my knowledge of what I know to be true today to you as the audience. And in this situation of invitational rhetoric, the audience would be able to receive this information without feeling like they're being persuaded to change, to see things my way. The audience would also be able to interact during this conversation by asking questions for clarification, as well as providing their perspective and beliefs within the conversation. The ultimate goal would be establishing a mutual understanding between the rhetor and the audience without denigrating or judging one another's perspectives and beliefs. Now, unlike traditional rhetoric, whose end goal is to influence change within an individual, as stated, invitational rhetoric looks for merely a mutual understanding being the end state, and not change per se. Now, Foss and Griffin do acknowledge that change can occur as a byproduct of their invitational rhetoric theory. However, it is not the goal in mind. Now, the second rhetorical form that they speak of is the idea of setting external conditions so that the offering of perspectives can occur in an open and free manner. And they suggest that there are three conditions that must be set. That is safety, value, and freedom. The safety for the individuals to feel that they can provide their perspectives without fear of being judged, an understanding that there is an intrinsic and eminent value within the individual as well as their perspectives, and that they have a place within the conversation. And ultimately the freedom, which is the power to make a decision based off the information that is provided. And the key being that that decision is a free will and not one that is being influenced, actively influenced by somebody trying to persuade change within an individual. Now that we have an understanding of invitational rhetoric, let's look at some of the critiques that others have provided for this new theory. And one of the main areas that I found that most individuals took issue with this theory was Foss and Griffin's position on traditional rhetoric. Now, often throughout their essay, they speak to the fact that traditional rhetoric is associated with persuasion, and they associate persuasion with the idea of violence, and they suggest that, loosely suggest that all persuasion should be viewed as violent in nature, as you're looking to change and dominate somebody to see things your way. Now, the critics of the theory suggest that there's an over-exaggeration by Foss and Griffin on this association between persuasion and violence, and that they use this as a means to try to suggest that you denounce all forms of traditional rhetoric, or at least all uses of traditional rhetoric, due to that over-exaggerated violence. Now, the critics also suggest that persuasion doesn't have to be violent, that there are oftentimes situations where it can be civil discourse that is communicated, and such. Violence is not necessarily applicable to the situation. Now, another area in which critics find fault within the theory is in its limited applicability, and they look at this from a couple of different aspects. And the first being that they believe that there is unrealistic conditions that are required in order to engage in invitational rhetoric. Now, invitational rhetoric seeks equality. However, the critics suggest that you have to have the equality in place prior to being able to use invitational rhetoric, or else it won't work. They look to the fact that in the real world, in real world situations, that there's oftentimes inequality in societies and economics and political situations, and so somebody that's on the lower end of that inequality that would look to use invitational rhetoric is going to basically fall on deaf ears. That those who are in the power, the oppressor, if you will, is motivated by monetary gains, by power gains, and that merely offering perspective to these individuals will do nothing to change their mind, and ultimately would fail to gain that equality for the oppressor or the oppressed who's looking to gain the equality. And lastly, they look at the theory as being an incomplete form of communication, with the suggestion being that you can only find it in small bits and pieces, that there's no way to have a conversation start to finish that is rooted in invitational rhetoric and have any kind of productive outcome. Now, some of the areas in which we look to invitational rhetoric being applied, the first being a situation in which Foss and Griffin posited within their own essay on the proposal for the theory. And this would be an example that they provided from a 1974 acceptance speech by Adrienne Rich. Now, Adrienne Rich was accepting an award for poetry from the National Book Awards, and what she did was co-authored the acceptance speech with the other two nominees, Audre Lorde and Alice Walker. And whoever was going to accept the award at the end of the day would read the same speech. And in the speech, the ladies posited that they couldn't accept the speech on behalf of themselves, and rather they accepted the speech on behalf of all women who were dealing and battling against oppression and inequalities in their current states. Now, how Foss and Griffin posit that this acceptance speech is invitational rhetoric, is that the authors of this speech never suggested that the audience should change their views to see things their way. They merely offered their beliefs and their perspective on the award and the fact that they needed to accept it on behalf of all women. They even went as far as to acknowledge and respect the beliefs and the processes in which the judges went through to select a winner for the award. Now, another area in which an individual has suggested the possibility for invitational rhetoric to be used is by an individual named Sanja Modesti, in which her essay articulates the fact that she sees a need for communication tools for educators speaking with caregivers or parents of students. And in her essay, she discusses the fact that oftentimes there are situations where these caregivers or these parents are engaging with teachers in very argumentative and sometimes forceful communication situations. And what she suggests is that these educators need to be equipped with the proper tools, communication tools, in order to be able to relay information to these caregivers. And her suggestion is that invitational rhetoric is the perfect form in which she can have educators relay information to the caregivers in a manner in which they don't feel threatened and they don't feel like they're being persuaded to change their viewpoints. And lastly, Jeffrey Murray looks at invitational rhetoric not as a standalone communication process. Rather, he looks at it as a tool within an overarching process of communicating. And what Murray suggests is that invitational rhetoric should go hand in hand with more traditional forms of rhetoric when you're looking to persuade individuals in a moral and ethical way to change their viewpoints. And the suggestion is that you must first use invitational rhetoric to establish that context where the individuals communicating together feel safe and free to engage in communication, provide their opinions, and then you switch to a more traditional form of rhetoric in order to help persuade them in a moral and ethical manner to see things your way. And one last area in which I offer the application of invitational rhetoric would be in a biblical standpoint. Now, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15 states, "We should always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks, to give the reason for the hope you have, but do this with gentleness and respect." Here I think this is a perfect phrase or a perfect verse. It speaks to the possibility of invitational rhetoric within a biblical perspective. Here we're being called to provide our belief and share our faith in Christ, but we're called to do so in a manner that's respectful to the non-believers, and one that's not necessarily persuading or trying to dominate them into changing their views to the views that we have of Christianity. In his book, Share Jesus Without Fear, William Fay discusses ways in which we as Christians can go about relaying the good news of Jesus and the love of Jesus Christ and our beliefs in Christianity. And I believe that his underlying theme that he has throughout this book is one that can be associated with the idea of invitational rhetoric. I think that invitational rhetoric is an ideal framework from which we can seek to do evangelism and spread the word of Jesus Christ. One of the quotes that I pulled from William Fay's book is that he says, "Success is not forcing someone to make a commitment to Christ." Here he's talking about the idea that it's not our job as Christians or evangelists to convert the non-believers. So we shouldn't feel like we failed if we provide our faith in Jesus Christ and our beliefs in Christianity, and the non-believer doesn't immediately change and conform to our beliefs. The understanding is that it's upon God to use our interactions with these individuals over time, in His time, change their hearts and ultimately lead them to Christ through our interactions with the individuals. William Fay suggests that on average it takes roughly 7.6 times of hearing the Gospels before a non-believer will look to change their beliefs. So again, I believe that applying invitational rhetoric in this situation affords us as Christians the opportunity to relay the Gospels, to tell of our love for Jesus Christ and His love for us, and yet not feel like failures if and when the non-believer receives this information and chooses to maintain their position and beliefs in religion. Again, we are called to merely provide the information, to be the vessel in which God works to convert these individuals. But finally, as an overview, I just come back to the idea that I do find applicability for invitational rhetoric within our communication, especially as Christians, as I just laid out. It's an opportunity for us to relay information to the non-believers in a manner in which is safe for them to receive it, and ultimately of their own free will, with the guidance of God, to make their decision to believe in Jesus Christ as well. It also provides us an opportunity as Christians just to communicate with our family, our coworkers, our friends in a more loving and accepting manner as well, ensuring that we don't look to forcibly empower ourselves or our beliefs over someone else. Rather, we engage in communication in a manner that's loving and caring overall.